want to welcome you all to this Work and Equalities Institute policy seminar. My name's Emma Bannister. I'm a professor in consumption and society in AMBS, and also I'm a member of the Work and Equalities Institute. I'd also like to introduce Lindsay Endell, who is the WEI manager and will be helping me in ensuring that this event runs smoothly and has been largely instrumental in getting this event off the ground. So thank you very much, Lindsay. For those of you who haven't attended WEI events before, the focus of the Institute is on bringing together expertise across a range of areas, including human resource management, industrial relations, organisational psychology and sociology, to develop interdisciplinary approaches to addressing core policy and intellectual challenges. We've addressed a range of areas in our series of policy discussions, which have included looking at wellbeing and developing decent work. So we're delighted today to welcome both our contributors and our audience for what we hope will be a fascinating, although at points slightly concerning, discussion. We all know that the Covid-19 pandemic has had a significant impact on work and working lives across the world, and there's a recognised need to consider the issue of differential impacts across demographic groups. So in this event, we will specifically consider the impact of the Covid-19 pandemic on working women, looking at issues such as equality at work, flexible work, parental support, and pregnant workers. So I'm going to introduce each speaker properly as we come to them, but just to say we're really pleased to have such a fantastic panel with presentations from Dr. Isabel Tavora from the WEI itself, Ross Bragg, who's the Director of Maternity Action, Dr. Zoe Young, Director of Half the Sky, and Sian Elliott, who's the TUC's Women's Policy Officer, as discussant. But before we start, just a couple of housekeeping things. Please, can everyone but the speaker keep themselves on mute during the presentations, just to sort of cut out any background noise. We've enabled closed captions, so if it would be helpful for you to see these, so a kind of running transcript of what's being discussed, please see there should be a button at the bottom of your screen where you'll be able to enable this. The session is going to be recorded, but this will be a speaker view, so should only capture the speaker. And if you don't want to be recorded, please do feel free to turn your video off. After each presentation, there should be time for one or two very brief questions, so sort of perhaps a point of clarification, something that specifically refers to the presentation itself. However, what we want to do is keep the main discussion for after the three presentations and following Sian, who will lead the discussion. So please don't worry if we don't get to you immediately. We should have time during the discussion part of the event. If you want to ask a question, please feel free to put it in chat. You can do that at any point during the session itself. We can come back to it during the discussion, and Lindsay and myself will kind of monitor the chat and ensure we spot this. You can either put the full question or just indicate that you have one. Either way, unless you indicate otherwise, we'll come to you and you can unmute yourself and ask the question yourself. So otherwise, please just use other conventions such as raising your real or your virtual hand, and we'll try and ensure that we get through to everyone. So I think we're ready to get started, unless I've missed anything. Lindsay, just shout out if there's anything I haven't covered. I'm going to take that as a no.
No, I think you've covered everything.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. So to start off with, it gives me great pleasure to first introduce you to my colleague Isabel Tavora. I'm going to have to stop share actually so she can share her slides, who is a senior lecturer in human resource management at Alliance Manchester Business School and a member of the Work and Equalities Institute. Her research focuses on comparative employment policy, collective bargaining, gender equality and work-family reconciliation. Isabel chairs the school's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and she's going to talk to us about some comparative research undertaken during the first wave of COVID-19 that reviewed the potential impact of the pandemic from a gender perspective. So thank you for joining us, Isabel, and I will pass over to you.
Thank you very much. And thanks also for the opportunity to present this work. This refers to a research that I conducted with Professor Joe Rubry, who is the director of the Work and Equalities Institute. This research was conducted in the very beginning of the pandemic during the first lockdown, and we tried to look at the implications for gender equality at work of the pandemic and the extent to which the policy responses of governments across Europe also supported women as well as men. And we have drawn mostly on very rich data that emerged very quickly in the beginning of the pandemic, and was mostly made available, mostly not solely, but to a great extent made available by international organizations such as the Eurofound, the International Labour Organization, and the OECD, who created databases of the policy responses of governments across the world to support workers and also working parents. So we've done on this to a great extent, but we also complemented this data with requests to a network of experts from a network of about 30 experts in different countries who helped us to fill the gaps in the data and also fill the gaps in our understanding of the equality implications of the policy responses of governments in Europe. And with Europe, I mean the European Union member states plus the UK. So, what were the main threats in terms of of gender equality in employment brought about by the pandemic? So, the risks that women would be more negatively affected by the pandemic were due to three main sets of reasons. Firstly, like in all crises, the most immediate effects on employment by gender are due to gender segregation. And while professional women were relatively well protected, women are also overrepresented in the sectors that closed down and in the jobs that could not be done from home, such as personal service workers, hospitality, and some cleaning jobs. A second reason why women were more at risk is that women also have more limited access to income and employment protection, partly because women tend to work shorter hours, they tend to be paid less, they also have more interrupted careers, and also because the jobs and sectors where they tend to work are not always covered by certain types of support. And the best example of this is the job protection schemes that already existed before this crisis, and namely in the financial, were provided in the financial crisis, but mostly targeted jobs and sectors where men tend to be overrepresented, such as manufacturing. However, during this pandemic, we did witness quite a substantial positive innovation in this area. Not only we observed that in all countries that we studied, creative job retention schemes or short working schemes that supported workers in the sectors that were most affected by the pandemic. But this was not just in manufacturing, as in previous crises, but was extended also to service sector jobs where women tend to work. They also covered smaller firms to a much greater extent than they did in the financial crisis. They also became more inclusive in the sense that the support was not just targeted at employees as previously, but also included self-employed and part-time workers, and in the UK, at least formally, also covered 0-hour contracts. But some gaps still remained that had a gendered character. So, for example, domestic workers were not covered in Bulgaria, and in Italy, domestic workers was also excluded in the beginning. They were later brought in, but at a lower rate of compensation. In some countries, part-time workers were excluded as well, and mini-jobbers in Germany were also not covered by these schemes. But we also then saw some positive innovation also in terms of the level of benefits, in the sense that lower paid jobs or lower paid workers tended to be compensated at higher rates than better paid workers. But what I wanted to focus more was on the third set of reasons of why women are more at risk of being negatively affected by this pandemic crisis. And that is mainly due to the fact that childcare is not equally divided or shared between the genders, and that women tend to take on a lot more responsibility for care. And this crisis, particularly during the lockdowns and because of the school closures, this created a huge additional amount of childcare in families. And so there was always an expectation that women would be more negatively affected by this increase in childcare. And early data did confirm these expectations, and women did seem to be taking and to have taken the lion's share of this additional care. Even though men also increased their involvement very substantially, women still took the lion's share of it. Now, the positive side of this story is that governments did respond to this throughout European countries. And the main way which they provided some support for parents struggling with this additional childcare was through providing a special parental leave scheme during the COVID crisis. Now, so 19 countries provided dedicated parental leaves. We decided to, well, the UK is a particular case in the sense that there was not a dedicated parental leave scheme created, but job retention scheme could be used for childcare reasons. So we decided to, for the sake of the comparison with the other European countries, to treat it as a sort of parental leave. So taken together, these schemes provided a very important support for parents, but we found a considerable level of variation between the schemes in a number of areas. First, on whether they required the consent of the employer, and this was the case of the UK, but also of Austria, Belgium, and Cyprus. But in the vast majority of countries, these parental leave schemes are provided as a right. And this is important because if it requires employer approval, and if the employer does not agree, then one of the parents will have to quit or may have to quit employment. The other area of variation was in terms of the level of pay. In 10 cases, the pay was the same or higher than the job protection schemes. It was lower in the other countries and unpaid in Spain. And this is also an important area for gender equality, because if the pay is the same or higher as job retention schemes, that signals that care is valued in a similar way as paid work is. It also indicates that or acknowledges the contributions, the financial contributions of both parents for the family. And it also recognizes the right of both fathers and mothers to an independent income. There was also some variation in terms of the inclusivity of these schemes. And while in most countries, self-employed were covered, there were also cases of countries where parental leave was restricted to employees. There were differences also in terms of the design. And here, what was most interesting, and unfortunately was also only in a very few countries, was that in these few countries, the leave scheme provided opportunities for parents to share the scheme, or even incentives for this to happen. So, for example, in Belgium, the parental leave could only be taken part-time, up to 50% of the time, so that in order to provide full-time childcare, both parents would have to use the leave. And finally, another source of variation between the countries was whether the leave was available only to those in jobs that could not be done from home. This was a condition in some cases. So, for example, in Austria and in Portugal, at least initially, parents could only take leave if none of the parents could work from home. And this was inadequate in the case of parents of young children, because it was not possible to provide full-time care and at the same time to do work as usual. So it was clear to us that to ensure gender equality, COVID leaves should first be a right of working parents and not dependent on employer consent. They should provide a decent independent income to the parents using them, support parents of very young children, even if their jobs could be done from home, and include opportunities and incentives for fathers to share. So we've considered a number of the risks, and I've discussed this already significantly, but there were also opportunities in terms of gender equality that came about with this COVID crisis. First of all, it is true that women did take the lion's share .
Isabel, you just went on mute, actually.
Yes, I don't understand what happened. I didn't do anything. But I was not mute before, was I?
No, you were fine. It was just at that moment, and you're okay now. I don't know what happened.
Yes, a message appeared for me to unmute, and I did so. Okay, so I'll just repeat what I just said. So the research did provide, so our research indicated some of the risks to gender equality, but it also indicated some opportunities in terms of gender equality. So first of all, even though women did take the lion's share of care, of the additional care, because they were already doing more anyway, men actually increased their participation in care also quite significantly. And this could have a long-term impact, but for that to happen, it would also be important that there are policy incentives and opportunities for men to continue to be involved in care. The experience also of teleworking or working from home and working more flexibly from home could also contribute to the spread and the normalizing of home working and flexible working. And also, and if this happens, that could contribute to the reduction of the stigma and penalties associated with these work arrangements. Another opportunity or a positive aspect of the COVID crisis and responses was that this expansion of social protection that covered more than before female-dominated industries and jobs. And so the crisis did show a potential for rapid and radical change with respect to making social protection more inclusive and more universal in a way that didn't seem possible before this crisis. And we also tried to think in terms of how the COVID experience could be used by policymakers to ensure that both men and women benefit from the recovery, and that the recovery can create better work and income protection for all. And what became first clear to us is that the experience of job retention schemes and short working schemes and of working from home could promote or could pave the way for considering shorter full-time hours and more flexible ways of working within standard employment. And this could promote first the sharing of paid work, of the paid work that is available, and prevent or at least contain the increase of unemployment. It could also promote the gender sharing of care. So if people working full-time work shorter hours, that would surely create better opportunities for fathers to share childcare and to become more involved with family life. We also thought that this could create or promote women's economic independence, in the sense that those working in casual and part-time employment due to family responsibilities and childcare could have the opportunity to move into more standard employment if standard employment involves shorter full-time hours that are also more flexible and more family friendly. So the idea here would be to make full-time hours shorter and shorter full-time hours standard, so that everybody has the opportunity to be fully involved in the labor market, have a decent income, but at the same time have the time and flexibility to provide care. And finally, the experiments with job retention scheme and with the parental leave schemes used during COVID across Europe could also be used to ensure more universal social protection for all. And I'll finish here. I'll just show the reference of the book chapter that can also be circulated through the and made available after this event. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Isabel. And one thing I should have said at the beginning, we will be kind of making available a kind of write-up of the event on the WEI website, and we'll share any links that the presenters have shared with us as well on that. So thank you so much, Isabel. As I said, we'll just have time for sort of one, perhaps two questions following each presentation. So I don't know if anybody had anything they want to ask Isabel right now before we go to the next presentation. We will have a much fuller discussion at the end. So do we have any questions? See if I can actually see all the participants, which I can't at the moment. Can't actually see if anybody's got their hands up. So if anybody does have a burning question and wants to unmute themselves, otherwise we'll...
Emma, it's Sheena here. There was a comment that somebody had put in the chat that we might just want to pick up in the panel discussion later, which was just saying it's not just about childcare, it's also other types of care like elderly care, and I think that's touched upon, but maybe we can pick that back up later.
That would be really good. I can see that, yeah, from Patricia. So yeah, maybe that's something to sort of bring up for all the sort of contributors. I think what we'll do is, thank you so much for that, Isabel. Lots for us to think about. What we'll do is we'll move on to the next speaker, and we will come back to questions in the discussion. So thanks again, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ros Bragg, to you now, who is the director of Maternity Action, which is the UK charity campaigning to promote, protect and strengthen maternity rights in the areas of employment, social security and healthcare. So Ros has led the organisation since it began in 2008 and has pursued campaigns to challenge paternity discrimination in the workplace, to end charging vulnerable migrants for NHS maternity care and to reduce maternal health inequalities. She's worked in the voluntary sector and civil service in the UK and Australia. And I'm sure Ros has got lots more that she wants to tell you about Maternity Action itself. So I'm going to hand directly over to Ros. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emma. I'll see if I can share my slides. Doesn't seem as though I can get the full slideshow here.
We can, are you able to move, because that looks, I mean, I know it's not in slideshow view, but if you can move through them like that, that still looks great.
As long as people can read it. For some reason it doesn't want to do slideshow, but we'll get started. Okay. Well, thanks very much, Emma, for that very kind introduction. And thank you for the invitation to speak today. I think it's a really important topic for us to be looking at. I think looking at the fallout from the pandemic and how working parents have dealt with it, indeed how governments have responded to it. I'll be speaking today about the impact of the pandemic on pregnant women in the workplace. I'll be talking about the impact on safe working conditions, about the operation of furlough and self-employed income support schemes, and about the protections against discrimination in the downturn. I wasn't planning to cover the impacts on pregnant women as carers, as I know other speakers are looking at this, though it's certainly been a huge issue for women to deal with. Firstly, a little bit about Maternity Action. As Emma said, Maternity Action is the UK's maternity rights charity, and we work specifically in the areas of employment, social security and healthcare. We deliver advice on maternity rights at work, maternity pay and benefits, and we have a strand of work with migrant and asylum seeking women, which I won't be discussing today. Each year we advise around 3,000 women and their partners, and we have more than 50 online information sheets which are viewed over 1.3 million times. Our in-house legal team has expert knowledge of employment law, and through our advice services we see how this plays out in practice, which is the basis of my talk today. There is often a very significant gap between formal legal rights and what women are able to negotiate in their workplaces. We have a very active program of policy and campaigning to seek to change the law, policy and practice affecting pregnant women and their families. And throughout the pandemic, we've been feeding our experience of advising pregnant women into government policy processes. In the course of 2020, we wrote 21 letters to the government on the changes needed to the various coronavirus guidances, to employment law and social security provisions. We gave evidence to the Women and Equalities Select Committee inquiry into equalities in the pandemic, and we worked closely with the Petitions Committee, which drafted a very good report on maternity rights in the pandemic. We also threatened government with legal action on a few occasions as part of our campaigning work. When the pandemic hit, our first concern was to ensure that pregnant women were able to negotiate safe working conditions. And I think it's fair to say that this is an area in which the government abjectly failed pregnant women. An employer's legal obligation towards a pregnant employee is that they must conduct a risk assessment and make adjustments to manage those risks. If they can't manage those risks, they should offer women suspension on full pay. I think it's important to note this, that suspension on full pay can be required by law when an employer cannot offer women safe working conditions. Prior to the pandemic, there was good evidence that health and safety protections for pregnant women were not working effectively, and that this was leaving a significant number of women in unsafe working conditions and forcing many others to leave their jobs. The 2016 Equality and Human Rights Commission research into pregnancy and maternity discrimination found that 4% of pregnant women and new mothers left their jobs because of unsafe working conditions. They found that for around half of all pregnant women and new mothers, employers did not follow the procedures or take the actions required by law. So prior to the pandemic, there was already a problem with health and safety at work. At the beginning of lockdown, in a media conference in March 2020, the Prime Minister declared that pregnant women were a clinically vulnerable group. This was reflected in the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions regulations. Clinically vulnerable groups are distinct from clinically extremely vulnerable groups, or the shielded groups, which were also announced in that media conference and prescribed in the regulations. The distinction is important. Those who were shielding were directed to stay at home and were given entitlements to statutory sick pay and access to a range of supports. Clinically vulnerable groups, such as pregnant women, were directed to follow strict social distancing, but were not given any additional entitlements or protections. So what happened in practice? What happened in practice was a lot of employers moved their staff to remote working, shifting them to working from home. And there were pregnant women amongst this group. This provided a fairly safe working environment. For those women in jobs which couldn't be done remotely or whose employers were unwilling to shift to remote working, the response was extremely varied, often to the detriment of pregnant women. A lot of employers immediately placed pregnant women on leave. Some were placed on statutory sick pay, some were placed on unpaid leave, some were asked to start their maternity leave early. Some were placed on furlough. All of these responses impacted on women's income. Rather than fully paid maternity suspension, which they should have been offering, or even the 80% furlough pay, many women were on the very low rate of statutory sick pay or no sick pay at all. A lot of employers insisted that women continue to work in public-facing roles. The regulations and guidance, as I said, did not prescribe additional protections for pregnant women, so many employers did not provide any. Pregnant women were treated by and large in the same way as other staff. And as you can imagine, this created enormous distress amongst the women contacting our advice service. They were simultaneously being told to follow strict social distancing guidance, and yet were unable to do so at work. To give you a few examples of this, a pregnant woman working in a supermarket was told to continue working on the tills without those large plastic guards which are now in place. She was directed to work essentially in the same way as other staff. This was a common direction amongst the smaller supermarket chains and corner shops. A pregnant woman who worked in an administrative role in a busy GP surgery was told to come into the surgery to do her work, even though it could be done remotely. She was told that they didn't have a spare laptop for her to work from home and did not intend to buy one for her. Another common example was a pregnant care worker who was told to continue work even in a care home with infected residents. There were problems with unsatisfactory PPE for many workers, particularly in the early months of the pandemic. We received a lot of calls from care workers placed at high risk of infection. Bad practice by employers was widespread, leaving many women in unsafe working conditions on reduced or no incomes. This could have been alleviated by the provision of government guidance to employers. However, this was not forthcoming. We wrote to the government and arranged for parliamentary questions to be answered. The Minister said that the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists provided guidance and that this was sufficient. This was, in our view, a gross abdication of responsibility, as the Royal College is an expert on clinical issues, not on health and safety law. After some months of pressure, the government finally released guidance, but that was in December 2020, 9 months after the pandemic began. And we have, to our frustration, yet to see any active promotion of the guidance by government. So many women and their employers are unaware of it. The precise risks to pregnant women were not known at the start of the pandemic. As the pandemic unfolded, research found that pregnant women were at no greater risk of contracting the infection. However, from 28 weeks gestation, pregnant women faced increased risk of serious illness. Women with underlying health conditions are also at increased risk of serious illness. This would suggest that additional measures should be put in place to better protect pregnant women from 28 weeks of pregnancy or with underlying health conditions. And we did ask government for this, but no measures were adopted. As a result, pregnant women are classed as a vulnerable group, are known to be at significantly increased risk of serious illness from 28 weeks or with an underlying health condition, but are by and large receiving no greater protection than the rest of the population. Moving now to the support schemes. The Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, or the furlough scheme, and the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme both offered financial support to employees and self-employed people. The furlough scheme paid 80% of regular wages. The Self-Employed Income Support Scheme paid 80% of trading profits. Furlough was and continues to be an incredibly valuable scheme for workers who are unable to work during the pandemic. The employer can claim the payments back from government, so is able to provide support to workers without cost to themselves. Pregnant women and new mothers are entitled to use the scheme if they met the criteria. The problem with the furlough guidance is that it did not mention pregnant women. Despite many attempts by us and others to influence government on this, it continues not to mention pregnant women. In the absence of any mention of pregnant women, many employers concluded that pregnant women were not entitled to be placed on furlough and consequently refused to do so. The scheme does require both employer and employee to agree to furlough, so there is little that women can do about it. They cannot require the employer to offer them furlough. While some pregnant women were placed on furlough, many were not, even when all other employees were placed on furlough. The initial iteration of the furlough scheme had criteria which disadvantaged women who had taken maternity leave. Furlough calculations were based on maternity pay rather than regular pay. Women who received maternity allowance rather than statutory maternity pay, or who had taken unpaid maternity leave, could find themselves without any entitlement to furlough at all. There are roughly 500,000 pregnant women in the workforce at any one time. However, no thought had been given to this group of women. We did influence government to make changes to the scheme to address some of these problems. However, it was months of correspondence and parliamentary questions to get the changes made. There are still some women who are unable to access the scheme, and similar problems have arisen with each of the extensions to the scheme. The Self-Employed Income Support Scheme was based on income over a 3-year period and made no adjustment for women who'd taken time out to recover from the birth and care for new babies. Women who had taken time out to have a baby could easily end up with a third less in support than someone who had not done so. It was deeply unfair. A recent judicial review on this issue failed to overturn it. Now move to discrimination in the economic downturn, which is the situation facing pregnant women as we come out of the pandemic restrictions. We are dealing with a significant economic downturn, and with the furlough schemes winding down, we're increasingly seeing large numbers of redundancies. Prior to the pandemic, we were concerned about the high levels of pregnancy and maternity discrimination across the board, and particularly in redundancies. We were aware that pregnant women and new mothers were at high risk of unfair selection for redundancy. We're now seeing this in the pandemic, and the numbers of women involved are significant. We regularly see redundancy processes in which all the mothers are selected for redundancy. We regularly hear of women being made redundant while their maternity cover is kept on. There are legal protections in place for pregnant women and new mothers in redundancy situations. However, these protections are weak and largely ineffective. We successfully campaigned for the government to commit to strengthen these protections. However, that commitment was given in 2017 and no change in the law has been forthcoming. So, in summary, what we've seen during the pandemic is an almost complete failure of health and safety protections for pregnant women, forcing women to choose between unsafe working conditions and leaving their jobs. The furlough and self-employed income support schemes have provided support to many pregnant women and new mothers, but many have missed out on support due to poor design and lack of guidance. And the waves of redundancies have disproportionately impacted on pregnant women and new mothers, and there's every sign that they will continue to do so. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ros. That strikes a very somber note. I wonder if anybody's got any sort of questions they wanted to ask. There are some questions coming up in the chat, mostly for Isabel. Please do keep your questions coming in the chat, because we will definitely return to everything during the discussion. Has anybody got any quick questions or comments for Ros at this point? Otherwise if you just, because there's so many people, it's difficult to see if anybody's, so do feel free just to unmute yourself if anybody's got anything they want to. I'm just having a quick flick through. Okay, I can't see anything just now. So what we'll do is we'll go, I can't get back onto the main screen. We'll go straight onto the next presentation, and then we'll kind of bring everything. Oh, hang on, there is a question come up specifically for you, so let's go to that now. So Patricia, I don't know if you wanted to unmute yourself or whether you wanted me to.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you very much, Ros, for those mapping out, the concrete issues endured by pregnant women. I'm wondering if you study some of the effects of ethnicity, because we know that not all people, there were, the COVID pandemic had a negative effect that was stronger, for example, in Black, brown individuals. So I wonder if you look at this in your studies or, research.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that. The data I'm relying on is predominantly the data from our advice services. So I wouldn't say we're in a position to speak with confidence about ethnicity. What I would say is that the types of jobs which are worst affected are ones which are more likely to be done, or disproportionately likely to be done, by women who are Black, Asian, or from a minority ethnic background. So care work, some retail work, some hospitality type roles. So I think it's very likely to have disproportionately impacted on that group of women. And I think that's something we'll probably see as the pandemic unfolds and we have more data about, particularly women who've lost their jobs in this time have been selected for redundancies.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And just one more sort of quite specific question for your presentation from Crystal. I don't know if you want to unmute yourself, Crystal.
Hi there, it's Crystal Wilkinson from Manchester Met Uni, down the road from the Manchester Higher. I'm doing research on complex fertility journeys at the moment, and starting work on perinatal mental health. And there's evidence that discrimination and stigma on maternity and pregnancy, also on mental health. So a possibility of kind of compound stigma, compound discrimination. I understand that levels of perinatal mental illness have gone up in the pandemic anyway. So I was wondering, is there any data that you're aware of that looks at the intersection of that and whether people have been, doubly disadvantaged maybe in this COVID period?
We're not aware of any data looking specifically at that. It may be out there, but we haven't come across it. I think there's little argument that the pandemic has worsened mental health for a lot of pregnant women and new mums. This is a group already at high risk of poor mental health. There wasn't much evidence before the pandemic about the association between problems at work and poor mental health. It's something we think is a gap in the literature, because it's pretty clear from our advice lines. We're talking to women who are often deeply distressed by what's happened at work, and it's not uncommon for women to end up formally diagnosed with depression, sorting out the problems that they're dealing with at work. But we have no figures to work with on this, and I'm not aware of any studies which are tracking it.
Right, so I'm hoping to start something on this, so maybe I could drop you an email and see if we can
Very happy to. Yes.
communicate. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Brilliant. I like to see collaborations emerging. Thank you so much, Ros. That was great. And I'm sure we'll come back to some of those issues during the discussion. Okay, so our last speaker, Dr. Zoe Young, is an organisational sociologist, writer and consultant. She's the founder of Half the Sky, through which she puts research into practice and seeks to make an impact on equality. Her research is focused on gender, work and organisations, and she's the author of Women's Work, How Mothers Manage Flexible Working Careers and Family Life. If you haven't read this book, I'd encourage you to take a look. And for this, she engaged with the lives of 30 women over 12 months, in particular focusing on their transitions into flexible work arrangements. But I know she's going to look specifically at her ESRC funded project for this presentation. So I'd like to pass you over to Zoe.
Yes, I'll have to come back another time and talk to you all about women's work. Let me just get my presentation up for you. Yes, good afternoon. As well as all of those things that Emma said in the introduction, I'm co-investigator on an ESRC funded project called Work After Lockdown. And as director of Half the Sky, and we're a research and evidence-based consultancy specialising in HRM and organisational behaviour, we are one of 3 partner institutions delivering the Work After Lockdown project. So we're working with colleagues in the business school at the University of Southampton and the Institute for Employment Studies. Now, our team didn't exist prior to the pandemic, and our project was formed in response to UKRI's special call for COVID-19 focused research. And it's a unique collaboration of academic and applied social researchers who lead the field in the study and also the influence of workplace policy and practice on well-being and productivity, on job quality and job design, and on flexible working. And I'll be speaking to those 3 themes today. Now, while our project was not formed to look exclusively at the impacts on women, we are looking for differences in the experience of working from home under lockdown and in the preferences of ways of working going forward. So the central question that the Work After Lockdown project addresses is, what are the lasting impacts of working from home under lockdown, both in terms of how employees want to work in the future, but how organisations respond and learn. Now, our first wave findings are published in the Transitions and Tensions report, which is available on the project website, and that draws on the period of our first wave of study that draws on that period of rapid change in relation to the lockdown of March 2020 through to July 2020, and in 2 industries, professional, scientific and technical, and public administration and defence. And as well as analysing the national data set, Understanding Society COVID-19 survey, we are walking alongside 4 case study organisations, 2 law firms and 2 local authorities in the 18 months of the project as they transition and adapt through successive cycles of lockdown, which we didn't know when we started the project. But we're interviewing leaders, we're interviewing managers, and we're interviewing colleagues without managerial responsibility. We've developed a new worker wellbeing survey that's administered twice, hopefully 3 times, to the same respondents, that will track continuity and change in worker experience and preferences for ways of working going forward. So today I'm going to talk briefly about what we learned when people went home. Just wondering why my cursor's not moving forward. There we are. And this draws on our first wave of data, which is around 40 in-depth interviews and 1,100 survey responses. And so You'll hear about the vital link between well-being and productivity, so essential for driving economic recovery from the crisis. You'll hear about workforce vulnerabilities, particularly in relation to health and well-being, work intensity and access to flexible working. And you'll hear about the vital role performed by line managers to motivate and support people through this period of business as unusual. I'll spend a few minutes explaining some of our headline insights, and then move to discuss some of the sort of broader policy implications that would benefit from some attention. But first, some context. In some organisations, the entire workforce is and has been working from home since March 2020, and that's certainly the case for our law firm based in Scotland. And for others, the working from home population represents a smaller proportion of the workforce, and in local authorities in particular, with a greater mix of roles and more sort of frontline workers who have never been able to work from home, and they need to be somewhere to do their jobs. So both environments are represented in our case studies. So what you can see from the table is the scale of the shift from between 1% and 4% of employees working mainly from home to over 50%, which is much higher in our industries than the UK figure at 31.5% at peak. And so to our first headline, that employee well-being matters and is material to productivity and performance at home. Now, we found that employees and organisations adapted well to the transition to home, perhaps unexpectedly so. And by self-reported measures of productivity, people felt they were getting as much, if not more, work done from home. Now, the chart translates to around 88% of our survey population felt that way. But there's a but, in that we found fairly low well-being scores, scoring 47 out of 100 on the World Health Organization 5 Wellbeing Index, and that is mirrors other studies looking at well-being in the UK and in other countries over this time. The UK is coming out fairly low, and our survey came out actually slightly lower than what we've seen in other studies. Now, we found that this productivity, this level of productivity, was not universally achieved, and some employee groups were particularly vulnerable. And these observations will echo some of the points we've already heard. So parents and carers of young children in particular, under 10, those living alone, and line managers struggled with work intensity, social deficit, and lack of appropriate space and privacy in which to work effectively. Now, a great benefit of mixed methods research such as ours is to be able to illustrate, to bring these issues to life and to illustrate them in the words of our participants, as this observation from a team leader demonstrates, where she said, people in our department were saying, yeah, they were fine, but I was getting emails at 2 a.m. saying, yeah, I'm fine. Childcare is a bit of an issue. And actually, when you drill down to it, they were absolutely exhausted because they're trying to deal with 2 tiny toddlers. The work pressure was immense. So clearly there's a gendered impact here. And I can only reinforce the points made about the lion's share of caring falling to women. And actually the representation among the line managers in our sample was that these were mostly women as well. So the single most valuable source of practical support to employees through the first lockdown was the line manager. And the line manager was at the front line of interpreting business strategy and policy around the transition to home, adapting jobs and ways of working in teams to be performed mainly from home, so remote from the office and remote from each other, of redesigning future plans. How will we work in the future, and of helping employees to work productively and safely from home. And this was additional work, often invisible to leaders in the organisation and not typically reflected in adjusted workloads for managers. And a great many stepped up. But some were exposed as lacking empathy, lacking insight into diverse workforce needs, and some of the unique challenges their team members were facing. Those employees who benefited from good line management in these circumstances were well aware of how lucky they were. As this participant says, beyond the initial sort of beginning of the pandemic, my manager has been extremely supportive, and I think that makes all the difference. We have very open one-to-ones, and I say how I'm feeling about things. I feel really lucky. Now, the view of our team is that having a good manager should not be down to good luck. And this is a theme to which we will return, the vital importance of management and investment in developing management skills and competencies for this very 21st century shape of work. Our third headline relates to flexible and hybrid working and the strong preference for these ways of working going forward. Granted, parents would prefer to do that with children at school and maintaining those social supports. 73% of our surveyed population seek to combine the communality of the office for learning, for creativity, for problem solving, for camaraderie, with the flexibility and convenience of working from home some of the time or for specific tasks. Very few said, I want to stay at home all the time. Very few said, I want to be in the office all the time. So the vast majority are in some form of hybrid space. But the discussion about hybrid working tends only to relate to place, time, and control over how work time is spent, how it spreads across even a day, a week, a month, a year, is equally important to employees and should not be forgotten about in the focus on place. So here I've summarised some of the positive employment trends that we feel have been accelerated through the sort of mass experiment of working from home under COVID-19 lockdown, as imperfect as it is. These represent some of the gains that we think will be important to future growth. There's much to discuss here that I'm sure we can pick up it when we all come together to talk. But we are seeing permanent workplace policy changes in relation to place. So working from home being more supported. One of the leaders we interviewed described the lockdown experience as helping them go the last mile with the structural and cultural change necessary to take this form of flexible working from the margins and into the mainstream to fulfill its productivity promise. And this is largely facilitated by a new climate of trust between manager and employee, and a new digital literacy among employees. Now there are other positives, but perhaps the most salient to thinking ahead to recovery and growth is that our insights point to the relevance of the principles of good work that described in the Taylor Review of 4 years ago, even more relevant today, around choice, autonomy, and flexibility, and a recovery strategy that is based on back to the office principles it risks undoing some of these gains. On the more restrictive side of things, our research identified some trends that may constrain recovery and growth. Now, some of this relates to the energy and the well-being of the workforce, which at the time we conducted our first wave research was a little depleted, despite demonstrating remarkable resilience. Our caution is that reliance on individual coping and doing the best and making the best of it is not a sustainable strategy to maintain productivity, and well-being should be prioritised for organisational stability and performance. People learned on the go how to adjust jobs and ways of working to deliver products and services remotely from each other and from clients. And we know from our research that few managers benefited from any training in this area. And there is sort of a new expectation of competency in what I would call flexible work design. And we're not yet seeing this reflected in a sort of parallel investment in employers for developing these sorts of skills that will position well for recovery and growth. Now, as other speakers have said, the pandemic experience more broadly, and particularly in relation to employment, has exacerbated existing inequalities. And we identify this and the creation of new ones. And if I move to my final slide, sort of thinking about addressing some of those challenges and developing policies that would support this new shape of work, I'm dealing in very big handfuls here. Just to pick out a few, our findings urge a focus on the skills needed to design and manage the fully rounded forms of flexibility that formerly office-based employees clearly want and need. So not just about location, it's about time, and it's about how those two dimensions come together in a job design. And the management curricula for this future shape of work is not widely available, and it needs to be. But investment in developing those skills doesn't just happen. So, policymakers will need to think about how to incentivize employer investment in skills development at managerial level, which is often the sort of poor relation to leadership development that we're seeing. I've mentioned that workplace is dominating the discussion around the future of work after lockdown at the moment. And our research does demonstrate an appetite from employees for more varied spaces in which to work. We're calling these third spaces of work, local to community and social support anchors, schools, childcare, parents, and there's clearly a gendered dimension in this. And policymakers will want to consider how third spaces of work could distribute opportunity for employment in good jobs in local areas. Which, and for people previously geographically tied and constrained from accessing them. Onto vulnerabilities before I just closed. I mean, going forward, it's going to be important to ensure working from home does not replicate some of the old experiences of flexible working, in that lower skilled and less experienced workers have less access to good flexible work. There is a very real risk of creating a two-tier system of flexibility haves and have-nots. And addressing this will require employers to re-engage with the flexible working agenda and consider the location and the time flexibilities that can be introduced to motivate, engage, and retain their workforce in the widest possible range of roles. Now, I will stop there. Thank you. And please be assured that I would be delighted to come and share our Wave 2 findings with you when we have those in July.
I'm sure we'd love to take you up on that. Thank you so much, Zoe. And also, I know that I'll put it in the chat, but I know that your preliminary report is available online as well. So I'll make sure I post that in a sec. Thank you so much for that. Fascinating. I know that we have got at least one quick question for you. I think Niall Kennedy, is it? Or is it Neil? I know that can be pronounced either way. Does Niall want to unmute yourself? Now, Kennedy. Okay, I can read his question. How much autonomy do you feel that employees, potential new hires, will have in the future to demand hybrid or fully remote working in their roles? Or will this remain wholly at the behest of the employer? Could hybrid working help open up certain industries that have historically been geographically specific?
Okay. What we're seeing is policy change around working from home and the language of hybrid working for existing employees. What we're not seeing so much of is recruitment, so hiring that is advertising the forms of flexibility that are available in a role. So making that widely available to new hires, that's not so common. Right. So we're not seeing that pick up just yet, although organisations like Timewise, who study the flexible recruitment market, have got some data on that does show an increase, but it's still something like around 15% of vacancies that have been advertised recently make any mention of flexibility, the flexibility that's available in the job. So we're not seeing huge changes there. For as long as employers aren't required to offer flexibility, then it will continue to be a sort of negotiated process between an employer and an employee. And I think the opportunity here is perhaps with the employment bill that we've been waiting for, to examine the rights and protections around different forms of flexible work, because at the moment the right is to ask, not to do, and it's moderate, it's mediated and moderated by the employer, and that's usually at the level of the line manager in discussion with their employer. And we need to, for as long as it remains like that, we're probably not going to see the flexible working transformation that many of us have been working towards for many years.
I know, it'd be interesting to see what happens with that. It's kind of almost dragging behind our kind of experiences in the past year, I guess. Thank you for that. What I think we'll do is there is another question here, but in the interest of time, what we'll do is we'll move on to Sian, and then we'll come back. I know there's there's quite a few things happening in the chat, but we'll come back to those in the panel discussion as some of them speak across the presentation. So thank you so much for that, Zoe, and we will indeed look forward to your sort of future findings as they emerge. So thank you, Zoe, and thank you to all the speakers for such insightful discussions of different ways in which the pandemic has impacted the lives of working women and workers more generally, and some thoughts about what the future might hold. So we're going to hear again, hopefully, from all the speakers during the Q&A and the panel discussion. But first of all, I'd like to introduce you to our discussant, Sian Elliott. Sian is a policy officer in the 2UC's Equalities and Strategy Department. She focuses on women's rights and equality in the workplace. She works on policy issues such as sexual harassment. There was a campaign, I think it was last year, representation of women in unions, occupational segregation, women in the labour market, equal pay, sex discrimination, etc., and maternity rights, and has therefore, I suspect, been kept extremely busy in this past year. I'd like to thank Sian for agreeing to be our discussant. I can't think of anybody better qualified, and invite her to give us her thoughts on what we've heard, and also some emergent thoughts and themes which we can pursue further with the panel discussion, as well as your own questions that are emerging. Thanks, Sian.
you very much, Emma, and thank you to Ros, Isabel and Zoe for such fantastic presentations. I've been sat furiously making notes just for my own personal use. That was absolutely so insightful and informative, and I think it's been clear to all of us, but made extremely clear today, that women and working women have been disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus pandemic, and that decades worth of gender equality progress at work has been undone and put in jeopardy in a matter of months. As Isabel showed us, occupational segregation by gender meant that working women have been acutely impacted by the crisis. And in particular, women who experience intersecting structural inequalities in the workplace. So as well as facing gender inequality, we know that Black and ethnic minority women experience racism that puts them at increased risk. Disabled women, migrant women, young women workers, all of these have faced even more acute, disproportionate impacts from the crisis. Women are the majority of key workers, so those working in jobs on the front line, in our shops, hospitals, care homes, in our schools, in public facing roles that have a much higher risk of exposure to the coronavirus. And as Isabel said, they're also much more likely to work in those shut down by the pandemic, so hospitality, food, accommodation, travel and leisure. Those women are much more likely to be low paid, to be in insecure work, and that particularly goes for BME and migrant women and disabled women, as well as younger women. And as a result of that, many women missed out on those vital financial support schemes and social protections. We know that migrant women with no recourse to public funds weren't able to access the same social protections that other women were during the crisis. We know in Wales, they temporarily scrapped that no recourse to public funds to ensure that those women and their families weren't plunged into severe financial difficulty. But in England, that didn't happen, and many were. I know that Isabel mentioned the statutory sick pay and other schemes. TUC looked at those workers who weren't eligible, who didn't qualify for statutory sick pay because they earned too little. 70% of the 2 million workers that were locked out of that scheme are women. A cruel irony, considering many of those are the women that are on the front line of this, working as cleaners and carers, carrying some of the greatest risk of exposure to the virus, but unable to access the same support that the rest of us can. And even those that do qualify for sick pay, unless your employer tops that up, and Isabel mentioned about whether this is something that government push or employers, here we saw a big difference around if you make it voluntary, actually £95 a week is the statutory rate of sick pay. That's a rate that most women can. And if your employer didn't top it up, and we found that many didn't, that puts you in a real disadvantage and in real financial difficulty. As Isabel highlighted, we know it doesn't have to be this way. There are different approaches from governments across the world that point the way towards policies that we could implement going forward that protect and promote gender equality in this country. Many of those policies are what trade unions have long called for. As Zoe just talked about, we have a day one right. We have a right to request flexible work, but TUC found 1 in 3 employers turn those down. What we need is a day one right to have flexible work. We need paid parental leave, and at TUC we're calling for 10 days paid parental leave. And we need policies that enable and encourage equal caregiving between mums and dads. Because as we saw from Ros's presentation, pregnancy and maternity discrimination is a huge issue. Prior to the pandemic, 54,000 women a year were forced out of the workplace due to the discrimination they faced. And those issues have been compounded during the pandemic. Gaps between women's rights and how they're able to assert them at work undermines the work that trade unions and women and organisations like Maternity Action are able to take to challenge unfair or discriminatory practices from employers, but also the lack of safe working conditions. We did some research, found very similar findings to Maternity Action, that employers have been failing to follow health and safety law. And as Ross said, it's been in place since 1999. It's really clear what employers need to do. Although it took government 9 months, how very apt to publish guidance on that. And we surveyed over 3,400 pregnant women last summer to find out about their experiences at work during the pandemic. And we found evidence of that widespread poor practice that Ros mentioned. Less than half of the pregnant women we surveyed had had a risk assessment at work, and 46% of those that had said their employer had actually failed to take the necessary actions to tackle the risks that that risk assessment identified. As Ros said, this forced many pregnant women out of the workplace in fear for their health and the health of their unborn baby, and many missed out on vital income, again in direct contravention of health and safety law that's been long established. Support schemes penalised self-employed women for having taken maternity leave, and it's been fantastic to work alongside Ros and the team at Maternity Action to really challenge the government on that inbuilt discrimination that government are baking into the system. And that's symptomatic of the discrimination that pregnant women face, and I think we've really got to have an eye to that as we're emerging out of this kind of initial emergency situation as we plan to rebuild our economy. How do we make sure that as the furlough scheme winds down, discrimination against women, against pregnant and new mums does not increase? And then Zoe's presentation. It's fantastic to hear about the work, Zoe, that you're doing. We know that businesses have denied flexible work for parents, for disabled workers for such a long time. As I said, 1 in 3 requests for flexible work were turned down in 2019. But then suddenly, when there became a business imperative to work from home, we saw, and Zoe, I think you called it a rapid and significant transition to working from home. It's amazing what employers will do when they're motivated. But this did come with some consequences, some positive, some less so. And I wanted to touch on those briefly because I thought you drew them out really, really well, Zoe. Some teams and employers we know have adapted really easily to this, really well. Our trade unions have been right there working with managers to make sure they're getting that management of remote teams right, staying in touch, checking in and supporting workers' well-being. Many have told us that they found a benefit in the time clawed back from stressful commutes, from that mental load. I'm a single mum. I constantly am having to think, right, run to the school run, run to get the train, run to get back again. I know that this time that I've clawed back has been amazing for my mental health. But we know too that single mums and many mums have had it really hard. Coping with the closure of schools and childcare settings wasn't easy. And as you said, Zoe, time and space is a key factor in that. Even in dual-headed households, IFS found that women were getting 1 hour interrupted time to focus on work compared to 3 uninterrupted hours that dads got. Women are much more likely to be providing that unpaid care for children, but also for elderly relatives, for unwell partners, for parents and others. And that has a huge impact on their ability to maintain paid work. A TUC survey that we did found that 1 in 5 mums, mainly those on low pay, had to drop hours at work or leave work altogether in order to cope with that demand that unpaid care was putting on them. We know that older women workers aged 55 and over were the fastest growing economically inactive group, again, because of that unpaid care demand. As Zoe identified, much of the experience that we've seen those workers who have been working from home has been down to how employers and managers support women or not, particularly around workload. Whilst employers patted themselves on the back quite often and said, we've said to women, work when you can, it's okay, do it when you can. What that didn't translate to was do what you can. And where that workload expectation doesn't change, that means women are working 14, 16, 18-hour days in order to get everything done. And that takes a huge toll on women's mental health. We surveyed at the start of this year over 52,000 working mums, and 9 out of 10 told us their mental health had worsened. They had increased stress and anxiety, and over half were really worried about the impact on their career from the ongoing disruption around childcare and the impact that was having on work. Many of the issues we've highlighted aren't problems inherent to flexible work or remote working per se. It's the conditions that people have been working in during the pandemic. Enforced home working at a time of acute uncertainty and stress, when women can't rely on or be in contact to see friends and family who might provide a lot of that informal care and support. That hugely impacts people's experience of flexible work and working from home. And I think there's been a comment, and I wanted to flag this too, 52% of the workforce carried on going out to work. Many of those women, because women are much more likely to be key workers, we've seen no change in flexibility for those workers. In fact, what those workers have told us is they've had work intensification, far less flexibility than they were getting before potentially. And so I think a couple of the key questions for me that have come out of this: how can we equalise caregiving between parents and men and women more broadly to ensure everyone has time to care and time free from care? How do we prevent women facing a motherhood penalty at work, whether it's during pregnancy in the early days of maternity leave or once they return and want more flexibility? And how do we strengthen workers' rights so that they do have that choice and an autonomy in how, when and where they work? And how do we change cultural norms to ensure flexible work isn't the privilege of a few, but is something taken up and open to men and women across a range of sectors and jobs? I'll finish there, Emma, but thank you very much.
Wow, that was fantastic. Thank you. I just sort of trying to hurriedly scribble down your questions at the end that you left us with. That was a fantastic summary of some of the key sort of themes and issues that were emerging. And thank you for sort of picking up on themes and really bringing together those presentations, and actually quite a lot of the comments that are going on in the chat. So you kind of did multitasking at its best then. So that's fantastic. Thank you. I don't know if we want to sort of first move to the presentation, the presenters, and see if you want to pick up on anything that Sian has said, or any of those, if you've got any thoughts on the questions, the specific questions that Sian left us with. And I'm going to have a quick sort of look down the chat as well, because I know there's lots of things going on in there. So does anybody want to respond directly to Sian here?
Well, I pick up your points about the day one right to flexibility. That follows on from some of the comments in the chat and from some of the things I was speaking about. I mean, in relation to, you know, if it continues to be optional, if only women with children are fortunate enough to be able to access different forms of flexibility, if it continues to be sort of controlled and moderated by line managers on behalf of employees, then we are no further forward to normalizing flexibility, which you would hope, and I think we have seen that with working from home, is that people have become more trusting and more accustomed to that as a way of working. But the risk right now is my point about back to the office principles, that risks undoing some of that trust and some of the good work around adjusting the time and location components of requirements of a job, and some of the workload work as well, if we revert to that. So it's just to echo the risk, and we should not assume that this is going to become the future of work now without further intervention on the policy front. I think, as you say, businesses have flexible working, particularly working from home, became vital for business continuity. So it's no longer a nice to have, something that helps retain valuable, talented people whom they may lose at other points. It became vital for business continuity, and some businesses have survived because of it. But that doesn't mean to say it's going to then become the way of doing business going forward, without active intervention to make it so, and to make the way that happens inclusive and fair. and accessible by the broadest population and not assessed on the basis of need.
Fantastic, thank you, Zoe. Does anybody else want to do a response to any of the points that Sian has raised?
I could respond to the question about equalizing or better sharing of care. How can we promote a better sharing of care? And I think that links to the reflections in the end of my presentation about, and may also raise other questions, because I think the solution to that is making standard and full-time employment shorter. So, but then the question then is how do we do that too? Because if everybody who works full-time works shorter hours, that surely creates better opportunities for fathers to be more involved in care. But then how do we move from where we are now to that way of working to a full 4-day week, or shorter hours for all, shorter and more flexible hours that's become also more integrated into the standard employment relationship.
And how do we ensure, I suppose, even if we did move to a shorter working week, does that necessarily mean that there'd be a more gender equal split of care? We don't necessarily know how that will pan out, do we?
I might, but at least create more opportunities for fathers.
Yeah, certainly the opportunity. Ros, do you want to?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question about how do you move from where we are right now into more equal care. It's a problem that existed before the pandemic, but we have seen what the possibilities are when we've got greater flexibility and greater working from home. Certainly, one thing we're very interested in is reforming shared parental leave. So we will have families from the beginning actually sharing the care more equally, and the current system simply doesn't work at all. We've had some media interest in this question over the last few days, so I'm hoping it will be something that will be on the government agenda here. But you have such a complicated system at the moment that no one really knows what their entitlements are. If you want to find out if a father's got a right to shared parental leave, you've got to look at his circumstances, you've got to look at the mother's circumstances. You might have leave entitlements but not pay entitlements but not leave. It's really terrible. So I think that would be a really useful one, and probably an easy one to do, to actually create a framework that would support more equal sharing from very early stages.
And recognising how different policy initiatives have to work together rather than sort of unilaterally, I guess. I just want to check, we're obviously just coming up to the end of our allotted time. We had checked with the speakers whether they might be available for sort of 5 or 10 minutes if we run over. I mean, I just want to sort of say to anybody who has to leave, apologies that we're going slightly over time, but as long as the speakers are okay, and I saw a couple of nods, we will just carry on for a few minutes extra, just because I think we've got so much to discuss. But thank you for anyone who does have to leave. There was somebody with their hand raised just now. I think it was Seema. I think it's gone down now, but did you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you very much. I just thought that we were rounding up the session. Just on a point of monitoring and evaluation, clearly from this very valuable call today, that there is a number of circumstances and a number of variables for individuals and households. And coming from a former mental health background, now in law enforcement with Met Police, career sort of transitioning, certainly I had my own challenges running a 4-borough service across what I would call my kitchen table during the pandemic. So in other areas of my life during the pandemic, I was fortunate, but perhaps my voice, sort of having a job, being in furlough, then being appointed, now no longer because that was contracted work, and working in isolation, both socially as well as because I live independently, not being able to kind of get the nutrients socially within work that I would normally expect, having career transitioned into sector from sector and a new role. But I think moving forward, one of the answers is, no matter whether we want to commute or the sort of flexible flexible working, whatever that looks like to people, is to ensure that HR provide a robust checklist of risk mitigation, no matter what that risk is. And I'm particularly coming from sort of 16 years of service development in mental health services, where I would apply a bespoke risk assessment for mental health carers, for example, where they would, against the statutory services in the UK, required to have a carer's assessment, but to make that assessment far more robust. And I think that, should sit with HR and the check and balance of the quality of that risk assessment and risk mitigation for the well-being holistically of that worker, whatever their circumstances, their economic and well-being should be assessed. And I'd like to see that be employed, particularly in this sort of post-COVID recovery period. Thank you.
Thank you, Seema. I don't know if anybody wants
to respond to that one. I mean, whilst our research shows a strong demand for working from home or elsewhere, third spaces, for at least part of the work, a week, and for the long term, for some people, as you identified, Seema, remote working has exacerbated isolation, anxieties, and physical health problems. In our survey, people were reporting more backache, eye strain, and so completely support what you identified, that a robust approach to occupational health must be maintained and incorporate the demands of working from home within its concerns, because if it's unresolved, we're going to see more, the mental and physical health issues are likely to increase, in sick leave, and which is going to incur sort of financial costs for organisations and the economy. And just to that last point about sort of productivity, this sort of mixed bag of productivity from working from home, we found a correlation between well-being and productivity, and that those with higher well-being scores were also reporting high productivity. So we can't say any more about the direction of causality, but it just emphasizes the importance of that relationship, which cannot be ignored if we are going to expect and demand productivity from here on in to recover us economically from the crisis.
Certainly, and then I think there should be sort of a further analysis of what does that productivity look like, which is something that was touched upon in the call as well. What does that look like? What are their expectations? And that to be renegotiated, because, it's an obvious point, but the world has changed so much. And yet, certainly my line of work, there was this assumption that our strand of business was going stronger and stronger. And I thought, well, how are you measuring that? But, that's just the final point. Thank you.
Thank you, Seema. Thanks, Zoe. I'm just looking down in the chat. Some of the sort of questions have been kind of responded to in various ways. I don't know is Ernestine still on the call? I don't know if you wanted to ask your question.
Emma, just to note that Jill Rubery is actually waving her hand.
Oh, is she? Jill, sorry, I can't see you. Well, let me just, because I've said Ernestine, I've got a feeling she may have left the call anyway, and then we'll go to actual rather than virtual hands. Thank you, Zoe. Okay, let's go to Jill.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I wasn't certain you managing to look at the hand, the other thing.
I'm not. I'm failing miserably. So
okay. I just wanted to draw a parallel between some of the work Isabel and I did and some of the points made both by Ross and by Sean, and that is the problem in the UK about the assumption that we can rely on responsible employers and give no rights to workers for these policies. I mean, it came up both with respect to pregnant women not being able to access furlough because they didn't have it as a right. We found it that right to furlough for childcare was dependent on what the employer thought, and I know Sean's work has revealed so many women having that refused. And it's just ridiculous that we sort of have these policies and everyone's saying, oh, we've provided all this support. You've actually provided no support if you don't have a supportive employer. And I think that's the sort of the ultimate problem that we have in the country, and we should say more about that when we're told how much support has been given. It's been given through employers, and it's a very sort of, obviously at this time, it's very easy to say employers are having a bad time, and many of them are, not all of them, but many of them are. And so to some extent they get, it seems fairer in some ways than it might in other contexts to allow the employers some discretion and not, beat them up about things. But in fact, all the rights have been with the employers. And on anecdotal basis, there's so many misinformation, employers saying you're not entitled to that, you can't have that because the government might want its money back. So my next door neighbour when he wanted to go on furlough, work while he was on furlough, and the rules are quite clear, but the employer has all the hands in their own, all the cards in their hand. So I think that's I would just wanted to put it as an ultimate takeaway from this.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And that sort of seems like, that's a depressing place to end it as well. But that sort of thing of sort of feeling not having much control, and kind of even after everything that's happened and kind of the sort of talks about hybrid working and everything, still feeling like control is in the employer's hands. I'm just sort of, I realise that we really are out of time, and I'm just flicking through the things that are in the chat. I can't see any hands that are up. If anybody feels in the chat that their sort of point has not been sort of covered in the discussion, because lots of those points have been discussed, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, now is your opportunity. Okay. Right, unless any of the speakers want to say anything else?
Hi, Emma.
Yes.
I think Peter Prowse had his hand up.
All right, Peter, do you want to?
I'm very sorry to interrupt them. Can I just thank all the speakers for the excellent work? There's three things I'd like to say. One of them is, this is probably, Sean will probably know, but and experience this. The CBI and the TUC have worked together. What's the government done? I mean, employers, I know not everyone, this is controversial, but employers have worked hard. The CBI have worked hard with the TUC to get furloughing done and a number of policies done. However, when you look at the norms, what happens is there's care workers completely gone, childcare is completely gone. We had a neighbour last week who rushed round to pick up their grandchildren, because at the very last moment the school was closed. Now this has happened to all my godchildren and nieces and nephews, and they're on the phone all the time. They don't have the parents to do that. They don't have the childcare to do that. That's why it's been a real strain. And I know some of my colleagues here have all experienced the same thing. So, I mean, it is a lot of individuals who have been heroes here, rather than big corporations. Big, TUC and CBI have worked together to get furloughing organised. I can't see the government would have been as quickly and as rapid a response, if not. And I don't know what Sean means, but it's just a comment and just to say how excellent this is. Thank you very much indeed for inviting us. It was brilliant.
Thank you so much. That's also a very good note to end on, and I'm sure we can sort of carry on with the discussions about this. We will be sort of producing something to put on our website, and what we're also seeking to do is, I know there's been lots of sort of links that have been put in the chat and things like that. Sean's extremely insightful questions that we will continue to discuss. So we'll sort of make sure that all that information is brought together, and please do check out our website. I just want to sort of say a massive thank you to all the speakers and Sean as discussed, and thank you very much to Sheena and to Lindsay for putting this together, and thank you to the audience for kind of tuning in. We've gone slightly over, but all your sort of fantastic comments and questions and everything, and it's obviously something that we could have spent a day on, and maybe we will look to sort of organise some kinds of follow-up event. So thank you very much to everybody, and look out, we'll kind of send out a tweet when we've got information on our website as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
just very quick thanks to Emma as well for fantastic sharing. So thank you, Emma.
Oh, thanks.
It needed to be said.
Thanks, Sheena.